Okay, gotta film this real quick before my roommate gets back and does whatever a roommate does. I don't know her that well, so I don't know what she gonna do. And by that I mean me and the voices in my head. We're back. I'm probably going to be putting out a lot more content than I did over the summer, so stay tuned for that. So a few videos ago I asked you to vote on the name for a little red character. Yes, that one. Well, never fear, she is to be named Missy Andre. If you have a problem with that, you can take it up with my complaints box. Second order of business, I'm coming up on 2K subscribers soon. Hey, for the special 2K video, we're going to do a Q&A, so comment in the section below. Third order of business, this video. Let's do it.
Stop equating science with truth.
On the table. You adjust the microphone as you talk, man. Hands on the lectern.
I have a feeling the rest of this video is going to be a little like that, to be honest. I'm alright. It's fine. I'm not gonna cry. I'm not gonna cry.
It's 2017 and people are still debating whether or not women are intellectually inferior to men, and whether we are entitled to a workplace that isn't toxic to people simply based on their gender and sex.
I can hear flip-flops outside my door. Okay, let me learn you a thing. Intelligence can be quantified in multiple different ways. In psychology, there are a few ways we can measure intelligence. At the same time, there are various types of intelligence that can be measured, so you fucked. Anyway, bear with me as you're about to get a crash course in psychology. According to Howard Gardner, there are 9 different types of intelligence, and those are naturalist, musical, logical mathematical, existential, interpersonal, body kinesthetic, linguistic, interpersonal, and spatial. Anyway, taking into account personal strengths in certain areas of intellectual speciality, it is possible you can be intelligent in more than one area. For instance, I am very good at musical, logical, existential, both inter and intrapersonal, but linguistics. Now, women are typically better at interpersonal and spatial reasoning language and such, while men are usually better at logical mathematical, which correlates so nicely into real life data having to do with workplace gender tendencies. With the overall percentage of all surveyed by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, of the 781 people who were employed as social workers, 81.5% were women. Of the 692 who were employed as preschool and kindergarten teachers, 97.5 were also women. However, if you look on the other hand, of the 1,483 employed as software developers, applications, and system software, only 20% were women. And of the 3,106 employed in architecture and engineering occupations, only 14% were again women. It's not necessarily that one gender has more intellect than the other, it's more that one gender has the propensity to be interested in one aspect of life over the other, and hence a little bit more intelligent in that area, considering they spend a lot more time in that area due to their interest in that area. I don't know about you, but I'd say that a woman who can figure out how to adequately control a room full of 20 toddlers without duct taping their mouths shut and locking the door is intelligent in a different way than, say, a guy who can program an AI to tell you it's perceived the meaning of life. But then that wasn't the point of the diversity memo if you read it at all, and not the fictitious Spark Note headlines from various news organizations. By the way, you're entitled to jack diddly squat, except for the liberties allotted to you by whatever nation it is that you call home. That is to say, no one has to be nice to you. Sure, it makes for a more cohesive environment if they are, but invariably that's up to the environment. You can either grin and bear it and demand respect over a course of time, or fail, leave, and move on with your life. But that's the beauty of free will. The possibility of anything within the bounds of reality can happen. Would you believe me if I told you that I'd been both the loner beta and the alpha leader at different times? That's because the beauty of social settings is that they change, and so too do you. That is the nature of humanity, to adapt. So then logically you should get off your ass and do whatever it is that you need to do to succeed. Or don't, and fade into obscurity. Frankly, I don't give a damn.
The Google employee memo about the apparent harms of diversity policies in Silicon Valley is both a shocking news story for the general public and for many women and gendered minorities, especially of color.
Especially of color. Why does it make a difference if a person is a specific race, creed, or gender? Let's take a moment to talk about the paradox that is equality versus diversity. Now, this paradox rests on two very contrasting ideas. The first is that women, men, and what have you minority all have the same thought process, the same capabilities, the same level of thinking, aptitudes, and what have you that qualify everyone as equal. The second is that everyone has entirely different backgrounds, strengths, cultural exposures, and insights that make them unique and special in their own way. Of course, if you see the issue with this dichotomy, those two ideals in great opposition of each other. Boom! By the way, you're entitled to jack diddly squat, except for the liberties allotted to you by whatever nation it is that you call home. That is to say, no one has to be nice to you. Sure, it makes for a more cohesive environment if they are, but invariably that's up to the environment. You can either grin and bear it and demand respect over a course of time, or fail, leave, and move on with your life.
Working in science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and medicine, a banal sign of normalcy. At least, science is helping us make progress, right?
Well, I don't know. Do you value your air conditioning? Vaccinations, perhaps? The ability to fly from place to place in a small fraction of the time it took one to travel from place to place on land before we figured out how to defy gravity? Or how about something a little bit more recent, perhaps? Recently, scientists at UC Berkeley made a thingy that pulls water out of thin air. Ain't that just gosh diddly fantastic? The prototype pulled about 3 quarts of water in about 12 hours. Oh, here's another one. Harvard scientists recently figured out how to turn hydrogen into freaking metal. It only took 100 years, but you know what? Sometimes science takes a bit of time. Whoop-de-doo. No noticeable evolution of anything happened overnight. Least of all, that of knowledge. But I digress.
Science is sold to us as an almost wholly objective pursuit, a pure endeavor, a way of pursuing truth and only truth. As a high school senior planning to study physics and astronomy in college, I was thoroughly convinced that solving quantum gravity would trickle down to improving human relations. Of course, I was adorably naive about both the difficulty that quantum gravity presented, as we've made little progress in the 18 years since I started university, and about the relationship between science and humanity's various imperfections. My education as a scientist did little to disabuse me of this simple view of science as a great unifier, as an objective means of distilling information. When skeptical members of my family argued that physics was dangerous because of nuclear weapons, I pointed out that it wasn't science that was the problem, but rather how people used it.
Your family sounds like a bunch of muttonheads, to be honest. But this analysis of physics doesn't negate you from making the very same mistake that your family has made, and that is assigning a human trait, such as dangerous, evil, or what have you, to an objective science. It isn't science that is the problem, rather the people. So then why the hell do you say we should stop equating science with truth, based on your own feelings about the results of scientific discoveries?
But nowhere is it more evident that the perspective is flawed than when we consider the uses and abuses of evolutionary biology and its sibling, evolutionary psychology.
Evolutionary psychology is dangerous because of gender roles, like physics is dangerous because nuclear weapons. Well, I guess so is chemistry because explosives. Never mind the entirely peaceful application of these sciences. Without physics, there goes thermodynamics. There goes all your food sources. Without chemistry, there goes your entire existence. I guess underwater basket weaving is also dangerous because people can drown. Do you see how ridiculous your reasoning is yet? Or should I continue? At alarming rates, people die in car crashes around the world, but is that going to stop you from driving? No.
It is impossible to consider this field of science without grappling with the flaws of the institution and of the deification of science itself. For example, it was argued to me this week that the Google memo failed to constitute hostile behavior because it cited peer-reviewed articles that suggested women have different brains. The well-known scientist who made this comment to me is both a woman and someone who knows quite well that peer-reviewed and correct are not interchangeable terms.
Here we go. But she said, failed to constitute hostile behavior because it cited peer-reviewed articles, etc. She did not say, was correct because peer-reviewed. Those are two highly incomparable statements. Unless, in using correct, you were referring to behavior and not factual. Given that you have yet to substantiate a claim to the contrary of what James Damore stated in his diversity memo, I think that your issue here isn't the science is wrong and thus faulty. Your issue here is more, the science is inconvenient and thus must be burned at the stake for the crime of wrongthink. But that's the thing. Science is empirical. It doesn't think so much as it proves a positive or negative. It makes an assertion based on evidence.
This brings us to the question that many have grappled with this week. It's 2017, and to some extent, scientific literature still supports a patriarchal view that ranks a man's intellect above a woman's.
And here's the thing. No, it doesn't. That's your perception of what the science has told you, when in reality, science is telling you that women and men overall have different strengths that tend to complement each other. And this makes sense. so long as you're using the full context. So let's tackle the stress argument, because it seems like the easiest one to, explain to you without having to go into a whole host of data. Granted, I'm still going to do the data thing, but it's not going to be as extreme. Let's take the statement, women on average are more prone to anxiety. Okay, that on its own is actually accurate. According to the Anxiety and Depression Association of America, from the time a girl reaches puberty until about the age of 50, she is twice as likely to have an anxiety disorder as a man. On top of this assertion, let's examine why this must be. So let's give you an explanation as to why this is the case. One possible explanation could be the levels of androgen within the brain. Quote, from all behavioral parameters, the anxiety seemed to be more sensitive to testosterone. The most cited paper analyzing the effects of testosterone on anxiety in mice has shown in several experiments that testosterone, either endogenous or exogenous, decreased anxiety in elevated plus maze. Now, mice, you say. Mice are not human. Well, let me give you a real-world example. Have you ever heard of PMS? Premenstrual syndrome, or PMS, are a collection of symptoms connected to your menstrual cycle. Now I ask you, where does the menstrual cycle happen? Reproductive organs. Where do hormones originate from in females? Again, the reproductive organs, specifically your ovaries. Now, I ask you, a third question, what are some symptoms of PMS? Acne, swollen or tender breasts, feeling tired, trouble sleeping, upset stomach, bloating, constipation or diarrhea, headache or backache, appetite changes or food cravings, joint or muscle pain, trouble with concentration or memory, tension, irritability, mood swings or crying spells, anxiety, or depression. Go figure. Final question, what are most women lacking in abundance when compared to men? Dick. No, I'm sorry. Testosterone. Testosterone is the answer I was looking for. Now, that's some very loose analytical guesstimations for you, but it doesn't take a genius to make such a leap in logic. Of course, there should be more data, but I'll go ahead and pose a hypothesis. Women have increased levels of stress in part due to reduced testosterone levels. But if that's not good enough for you, here's another factor that might further contribute to the analysis. And it has to do with the rate of reuptake of the neurotransmitter serotonin in females. What does serotonin do, you might ask? Well, I'll tell you. It's a neurotransmitter that can affect just about anything from sexual desire to behavior to, get this, mood. And guess which gender just so happens to synthesize serotonin at a mean rate of 52% faster than normal females? Two guesses.
An Apache helicopter. An Apache helicopter has machine guns and missiles. It is an unbelievably impressive complement of weaponry. An absolute death machine.
Yep, that's right, Apache attack helicopters. I'm sorry, no, that was actually males. The mean rate of synthesis in normal males was found to be 52% higher than in normal females, and bitch, that was neuroscience.
It is easy to end up in an endless loop of using our prodigious scientific skills to carefully debunk the shoddy science that props up this argument. This is important and valuable work, but it's also worth considering why this loop exists at all. Science's great myth is that it doesn't encode bias and is always self-correcting. In fact, science has often made its living from encoding and justifying bias.
Mr. Strawman, take me away.
Refusing to do anything about the fact that data says something is wrong.
Let's talk about science and bias for a minute, why don't we? If science asserts one thing to be true based on evidence, and bias is defined as prejudice in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usually in a way considered to be unfair, then I guess I can kind of see where you're coming from. Science has a predilection towards evidence-based reasoning as opposed to feelings-based reasoning. But there isn't necessarily anything wrong with that, because it just is. What you or I or anyone else chooses to do with this information is what makes the determination of right or wrong. If I were to tell you that chlorosulfonic acid were highly corrosive, there's nothing really wrong with that in the moral sense, and certainly not in the factual sense. It just is one of those things. But if you or I or anyone else were to take chlorosulfonic acid and use it to decimate a fruit, waste a fruit, sure, but that's about it. Nothing really wrong. Now let's take it a step further. What if we took chlorosulfonic acid and melted someone's face off? Is that wrong? Duh! Facts on their own are just information at your disposal. Nothing more, nothing less. What makes them wrong or right, or what determines morality is what you do with the information that you have. Don't think I can be any more clear about that.
Most saliently, in the context of the Google memo, our scientific educations almost never talk about the invention of whiteness and the invention of race in tandem with the early scientific method, which placed a high value on taxonomies.
Maybe, because science doesn't give a flying fuck about a person's skin color or culture. Except maybe dermatologists and anthropologists, but it's their job to give a shit about skin and culture. I'm gonna let you in on a little secret. No one invented race. It's just always been a thing. Now, whether we choose to ignore it is a different matter.
Which, unsurprisingly and almost certainly not coincidentally, supported prevailing social views. The standard history of science that is taught to budding scientists is that during the Enlightenment, Europe went from the Dark Ages to, well, being enlightened by a more progressive mindset characterized by objective science. It is a rare scientific education that includes a simultaneous conversation about the rise of violent imperialist globalization during the same time period.
I think you're forgetting that the belief that women were inferior to men has been around a lot longer than the Enlightenment. Let's see, the Enlightenment started around the 17th century to 18th century, the most liberal estimations putting it at 1650 to 1701. Here's a quote for you. Women in her greatest perfection was made to serve and obey man. John Knox, 1558. Should I go back further than the Elizabethan era? How about the Middle Ages, when land ownership almost always passed to the eldest son or to all sons and only passed to the daughter when there was no son? Of course, that was universal in Normandy, where only sons could inherit land. However, you'll be interested to learn that in France they had heritable inheritance, so yay, I guess. But maybe that's not far back enough for you. Let's do this a third time. Ancient Greece set up the marriage system so that the average marrying age of men was 30, but the average marrying age of a woman was 14, so as to ensure that she, the woman, yet maintained her virginity. Women in classical Athens were barred from politics and had limited rights to property. Need I go on, or is that enough evidence to convince you that this wasn't a result of the Enlightenment or modern science? If there were ever an argument as to bias in the Western world against women, I would argue that, to be honest, it's more of a cultural tradition and religious origin than a scientific one. But what do you know? I can only use my brain to do complex reasoning and analysis. I should put that on a t-shirt.
Very few curricula acknowledge that some European scientific discoveries were in fact collations of borrowed indigenous knowledge.
Name me one fucking thing that was a collation of borrowed indigenous knowledge. I bet my right arm. The arm that I use for everything. Everything that she cannot.
And far too many universally call technology progress, while failing to acknowledge that it has left us in a dangerously warmed climate. Much of the science that resulted from this system, conducted primarily by white men, is what helped teach us that women were the inferior sex. Racial taxonomies conveniently confirm that enslaving African people were a perfectly reasonable behavior since, as Thomas Jefferson put it, black people were inferior to whites in the endowments of body and mind.
Now that sounds a lot less like a racial taxonomy and more like the observation of a man whose worldview has been extremely skewed to one small area of reality. I'm not saying that he's accurate, but when you have very limited worldview segregated to the US and the South, circa the 1800s, what can you do but make assumptions based on that? Kind of like an echo chamber. Weird.
Of course, this apparent inferiority never stopped Jefferson from repeatedly raping his wife's half-sister, Sally Hemings, herself a product of rape. Jefferson is remembered as a great thinker, but when one reads his writing about race, it becomes immediately evident that rather than being much of a scientist, he was a biased white supremacist who hid behind science as a shield.
So let's take a look at these rape allegations. I went digging, looking for where this originated from, actually. There are about two ways that people could have come to this conclusion. One, it's rape if it's about the slave owner and slave power dichotomy, and the other one is it's rape if it were about the age discrepancy. Now, I don't know about the first one. I wasn't there. It's gotta be one of those things where you gotta be there to know what it's like. As for the second one, given the age of consent in France at the end of the 18th century was first set around 13, which was around the age that Sally Hemingway came to live with Thomas Jefferson in France, that second possibility is of little concern to us. It was the order of the day, not saying it's ideal, but it was the way things were at the time. It's like judging someone in ancient Rome and Greece for thinking that humorism was an accurate and viable way to approach medicine. Other than those two things, the controversy surrounding these two is just so muddled that it's impossible to determine rape or not, especially since it was several hundred years ago and no one alive today was there. It's entirely possible that he did not rape her, but it's equally possible that he did. Look, I'm not saying that colonial America wasn't without its mistakes, but there's acknowledging them and moving on, and then there's obsessing over 200 years of history and letting old men in wigs and tailcoats from the 1800s get you all riled up.
The problem is that science was just the shield he needed in the 18th century, and unfortunately it seems that it continues to function that way today.
If you haven't noticed, science has gotten a lot better at being empirical. Give me one example of how science shields people from being assholes.
In other words, pseudoscience has always been a core feature of post-Enlightenment scientific knowledge, and it remains that way because scientists refuse to integrate contemporary science, technology, and society studies research into university curricula. And so too Many of us get out of school and end up in a world where we are suddenly forced to grapple with the reality of how science in practice is not as objective as we hoped. Enough of us have heard a man, sometimes the president of our college, sometimes our research advisor, express the views that women's brains just work differently.
Our brains do work differently. This assertion is based on averages. I already explained the data based on serotonin synthesis and hormone levels and explained the effect that has on a person as a whole. Is that not enough? How about this? Adjusting for age, on average, they found that women tended to have significantly thicker cortices than men. Thicker cortices have been associated with higher scores on a variety of cognitive and general intelligence tests. Meanwhile, men have higher brain volumes than women in every subcortical region they looked at, including the hippocampus, which plays broad roles in memory and spatial awareness, the amygdala, emotions, memory, and decision-making, striatum, learning, inhibition, and reward processing, and the thalamus, processing and relaying sensory information to other parts of the brain.
And aren't suited to technical skills the way men's are. Non-binary people don't exist, and transgender people are denormalized in their narratives. Women of color listen to white women normalize Europe as the birthplace of scientific intelligence while telling us that our curly hair is professional looking. Senior men who we would hope could be mentors turn out to be sexual harassers, and with some frequency senior women tell us to suck it up and lean in rather than helping us.
Here you go. This week's Strawman Award goes to you. Congratulations. I'm getting kind of sick and tired of these regressive talking points. I am so near offing myself with my brand new pirate sword, which I left at home. Time to book an Amtrak ticket. But then again, what did I expect from an article entitled "Stop Equating Science to Truth"? I'm doing this to myself. I can feel my insides curdling as the will to live slowly shrivels up within me. My soul screams into the abyss, agonizing and shrill as my consciousness is slowly dragged down to hell.
Last month, a study of women in astronomy and planetary science, led by University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign professor Kathy Clancy, found that women of color especially suffer from hostile working environments. In June, I contributed to a Nature Astronomy feature on gender discrimination in astronomy, as someone on Twitter reminded me last week when I posted a newspaper on particle physics because the authors of the paper are women. Based on the results of one featured study in that Nature Astronomy issue, we can expect 10% fewer citations. Google Bro would argue that we ought to consider the possibility that white women and racial minorities simply produce lower quality work, which is why we struggle to be recognized as competent knowledge producers. It's time to turn the tables on this debate.
Then prove them wrong. Yes, sometimes in order to combat certain prejudice, people hold we have to work a little harder than others to prove them wrong. I know I do. Of course I do. 5'1" 3/4", and I can take down a 6-foot man with fairly little effort on my part. And according to this internet IQ test I took, I'm a 147. So I guess I'm supposed to be some sort of genius or something, but that number doesn't mean anything to anyone unless I back it up. And how do you do that? By holding yourself to a standard above what other people expect of you. You want to defeat a bias, a prejudice, some stereotype that people have. Be better than it. Or don't. People are going to hold them either way. You can either let people overestimate you, or you can let them underestimate you.
Rather than leaning in and trying endlessly to prove our humanity and value, people like him should have to prove that our inferiority is the problem. Eliminate structural bias in education, healthcare, housing, and salaries that favor white men, and see if we fail. Run the experiment. Be a scientist about it.
Don't expect the world to get better because you want it so badly. You have to go out and defy expectations, and only then will the world adjust its schema to accommodate you. And that's the end of this video, guys. If you like what I do, please consider supporting me on Patreon or by visiting my Teespring store, links in the description. If you like what I do, but not that much, to the point where you want to spend money, I understand, totally, whatever. Just be sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and then sacrifice a virgin to the Lord Cthulhu in my name. Peace. Let's take a moment to talk about the paradox that is equality versus diversity. Why does sound carry so much in the hallway of my dorm? Let's talk about that. Can you not? Let's talk about science and bias for a minute, why don't we? Guess who's going to go on a murder spree? This girl.